what was said by another member. I think he's made his position fairly clear in the personal explanation that he's made. Question number 2, Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When was his Chief of Staff first informed about the role of the GCSB in the Kim Dotcom case, and when were officials from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, including the Intelligence Co-ordination Group, the National Assessments Bureau and the Security Intelligence Service, first aware of the Kim Dotcom case?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, my Chief of Staff was first informed of the role the GCSB played on Monday 17th September. He had been alerted the previous Thursday that there was a potential issue of illegality relating to an operation that GCSB had conducted in relation to Kim Dotcom, but at that time was given no details of the role GCSB had played. My office advised GCSB that the Director needed to directly brief me as quickly as possible, face to face. That meeting was arranged prior to the end of the week and took place on Monday the 17th of September following Cabinet. I'm advised that there was no involvement by any DPMC agency prior to the arrest of Kim Dotcom. With regard to the Security Intelligence Service, I'm advised that its involvement was limited to routine checks, which were made when Dotcom applied for New Zealand residency in 2010.
Point of order, Grant Robertson.
I appreciate that was a detailed question, and I also appreciate the Minister's answer. In respect of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, all he told us there was that they had no prior knowledge to the arrest. That doesn't really answer the question of when they were first aware.
Well, I think the Minister has gone to some trouble to answer the question with some particularity. When I read the question, I made notes of the first part of the question. The Minister should give a precise answer to that, because that is something that there should be a clear answer. The second part of the question, when were those various agencies aware, is a matter that's far more vague, and I think it would be difficult for me to try and pin the Minister down on that when there are further supplementary questions available. I think the Minister's made a pretty reasonable fist of answering that question. Grant Robertson.
Speaker, can he confirm, in light of that answer, that his Chief of Staff did in fact find out about the GCSB's role Thursday before the 17th of September, not the 17th of September as he told the House yesterday?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I can only repeat what I said in the first answer, which was that the Chief of Staff had been alerted the previous Thursday that there was a potential issue of illegality relating to an operation that GCSB had conducted in relation to Kim Dotcom, but at that time he was given no details of the role GCSB had played.
Grant Robertson.
On what date did the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet become aware of the Kim Dotcom case?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, on behalf of the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, I'm advised there was no involvement by any DPMC agency prior to the arrest of Kim Dotcom. I presume they read the papers at some point, the newspapers.
Grant Robertson.
Does he think that ignorance of the law by the GCSB and the police is an acceptable reason for what has occurred?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I have released a press release this afternoon which indicates my concern and disappointment at the actions of GCSB and the errors that have been made, and that's clearly laid out. And there's also an associated statement from the Director of the GCSB in terms of the actions they will be taking.
Grant Robertson.
Does he think that Justice Naser is conflicted in reviewing the actions of the GCSB in this case, given that his normal role involves monitoring and working with the GCSB, and is he in effect investigating his own actions here?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I think the role that Justice Naser, who I would point out as a former Solicitor General and a former Judge of the High Court, is exactly the role that he's undertaken in doing this inquiry for the Prime Minister.
Grant Robertson.
Speaker, does he think that New Zealanders have a right to expect more of him as Minister responsible for our security agencies than the casual, disinterested approach he has taken to this case?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I completely reject that assertion. The Prime Minister was advised and had the meeting on the 17th of September and promptly called an inquiry which has now been released today. It's pathetic to suggest that he was disinterested.
Grant Robertson.
What was discussed in the 15 meetings that the Prime Minister had with the GCSB this year if it wasn't about cases that involve the United States government, the FBI and a range of New Zealand agencies?
Insofar as the Minister is able to answer, the Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, firstly, obviously, those are matters of national security, but secondly, the member seems to be suggesting that the Prime Minister would involve himself in the operational control on the day-to-day basis of security services. That's a particularly...
No order. The member asked a question that perhaps there was certainly no way the Minister could answer it, but that doesn't mean he goes on to that sort of material. Grant Robertson.
Does he accept that as Minister responsible for the GCSB, he acts as the main democratic check for New Zealanders on our security agencies, and shouldn't he be taking his role more seriously than to have 15 meetings where apparently he wasn't briefed about one of these operations?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate Mr. Robertson is trying to obfuscate in this matter, but the reality is the Prime Minister was made aware on the 17th of September and then called an inquiry.
Grant Robertson.
Does he take responsibility for the actions of the GCSB, an agency for which he has ministerial responsibility?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, he of course is the Minister responsible for the GCSB, and as soon as the matters were raised with him, he called an inquiry. That inquiry has been announced today. It's exactly the right thing to do, and the member is being disingenuous by suggesting anything else.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Well, if that's the Prime Minister's answer, is he aware that the Inspector General is charged with also reviewing the manner in which the SIS interception warrants are sought? That he approved the Inspector General to lead the inquiry before he even ascertained whether the SIS were involved in the Dotcom case, and is that not new evidence justifying a full-scale inquiry into the matter, covering all departments and agencies involved in the case in order to ascertain what has gone wrong and restore the public's faith in these institutions?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, that was a mini-legged question. All I can say is that the report of the Inspector General is on the table today. It lays out clearly the mistakes made by GCSB and the actions to be taken by them.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister aware that in the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security Annual Report 2011, the Inspector General states specifically that, in particular, the Inspector General assists the Minister to ensure that the activities of the agencies comply with the law, and hence the Inspector General himself is implicated in the failure of the GCSB to follow the law. So having the Inspector General do the investigation is a conflict of interest.
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I reject the member's supposition, and I would point out that the Inspector General has done exactly what is required of him, which is to have an inquiry into the matters that have been raised in regards to the GCSB.
Point of order, Dr. Russell Norman.
Sorry. I seek leave to table this document. It is not available online. It's very difficult to get hold of, actually. The Inspector General of Intelligence and Security Annual Report 2011, from which that quote came.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Grant Robertson.
Does the Prime Minister accept that the precedent for a minister who is responsible but not aware of an issue comes from Dennis Marshall in the Cave Creek situation where the minister resigned?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I appreciate what the member is trying to do. It is the job of a minister to respond, and as in this case, as soon as he was made aware of the situation, to call an inquiry which has reported today, and actions are now being taken to correct the matters that have been identified.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister aware that under the GCSB Act 2003, there is a much higher level of ministerial control required than in most government agencies, and Section 8.3 says the performance of the Bureau's functions is subject to the control of the Minister. That is, that the Minister has specific responsibilities around controlling the actions of the agency. He can't just take a hands-off approach.
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I'm sure the member would understand that there is a fine line between actually taking control of the day-to-day operations, which I think would be, in fact, a pretty disturbing suggestion that the Prime Minister would be required to do that. The reality is all ministers are responsible for the actions of the department, and when a department actually makes an error, to investigate that error and to take remedial action, and that's what's happened in this case.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister aware that under the GCSB Act, the Minister in charge of the GCSB actually has to sign off personally the interception warrants, which means that the Minister knows the name and identity of the people who are having their communications intercepted? There is a much higher level of ministerial intervention into the operational and day-to-day activities of the GCSB than any other government agency, for the reason being that there is no other democratic oversight of the GCSB.
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I would point out to the member again that in this instance GCSB has made, as the Prime Minister has identified, 2 errors. They have now been investigated, and they were investigated promptly once the Prime Minister was made aware of those 2 errors. And despite what the member suggests, I think it's difficult for any minister to be aware of an error before it has been brought to their attention.
Question number 3, Jackie Dean.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Corrections and asks